My phone buzzed for the fourth time in an hour, and I already knew who it was before I looked. I turned it face down on the marble counter and kept measuring the ballroom ceiling instead, because numbers didn't threaten me. Numbers didn't tell me I owed them anything. The Marchetti estate sat on 11 acres of land that used to be a vineyard, and every person who worked there moved like they were being watched, because they were. I had been coming here for 3 weeks to finish the renovation before the wedding, and in that time, I had learned which staff members flinched when a door slammed and which ones didn't. Dante Marchetti's people didn't flinch. That told me something about the man who ran the place, even though I had barely spoken to him. I was up on the scaffolding, checking the crown molding, when I heard heels clicking across the floor below. Camilla Ferraro's assistant, a woman named Ines who wore her employer's confidence like a borrowed coat, stopped directly under me and called up that the manual labor needed to be finished by Thursday because the florist was coming. She said manual labor the way some people say a slur, soft and deliberate, testing whether I'd react. I didn't. I've been called worse by people with less money. It'll be done, I said, and kept working. That was when I noticed him. Dante Marchetti stood near the far doors in a charcoal suit, half listening to a security briefing from a broad-shouldered man I'd later learn was named Renzo, and half watching the exchange between me and Ines. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Ines glanced over her shoulder, saw him watching, and suddenly remembered she had somewhere else to be. I climbed down from the scaffolding once she left and caught him still looking at me. Not the ceiling, not the room, me. It wasn't the way men usually looked at me on a job site. It was closer to how you'd study a lock you weren't sure you could pick. You didn't have to do that, I said, because I don't like being handled, even quietly. I didn't do anything, he said. You stood there and she left. That's not the same as doing something. His voice was flat, unbothered, like he'd had this exact argument with himself before. You're the only person on this property who hasn't tried to compliment my house in the last 3 weeks. It's a nice house, I said. I'm just busy. Something in his face shifted, not quite a smile, more like the beginning of curiosity he wasn't planning on acting on. Most contractors bring an assistant. You do the ceiling work yourself. Most contractors charge for an assistant. I don't like paying people to hold a ladder. He nodded once, like that answer satisfied something in him, and walked away without another word. I told myself it didn't matter. I had a ballroom to finish and a phone full of missed calls from my brother, and a wedding coming up between 2 families I understood only as names on a contract. Dante Marchetti was marrying Camilla Ferraro in 6 weeks to keep 2 territories from going to war, or so the wedding planner had explained when she handed me the floor plan. It wasn't romance. It was paperwork with flowers, signed in front of a priest instead of a lawyer, but paperwork all the same. I understood paperwork. My father had left me a company and an unfinished will, and for the last year my brother Marcus had been trying to convince me the second half belonged to him because he stayed in town and I didn't. It didn't matter that I'd bill half of that firm with my own 2 hands, or that my name was on the patents. Marcus had decided fairness meant whoever complained the loudest, and I had spent every spare hour and every spare dollar fighting him for something that was already mine. I remember standing in that ballroom, tools still in my hands, thinking that at least here on a job site, nobody could argue with a measurement. A wall was either straight or it wasn't. Nobody could talk me out a level line the way Marcus talked himself into believing he deserved more than his half. I got in the job through a referral from a client who trusted my work more than my last name, which was exactly how I liked it. I never told anyone at the estate what was happening with my brother. I didn't want pity, and I definitely didn't want anyone deciding I couldn't handle a contract because my personal life was messy. So I showed up every morning at 7, coffee in one hand, tool bag in the other, and I let the work speak for me the way it always had. That afternoon, packing up the scaffolding brackets, I caught myself glancing toward the doors Dante had walked through, and I told myself it was just curiosity about the man who owned the property I was standing in. I almost believed it. If you've ever had someone try to talk you out of what's rightfully yours just because you didn't fight loud enough, tell me in the comments, because I was about to find out exactly how far my brother was willing to go to make me give in. I finished the molding just as the sun started dropping behind the vineyard hills, and I packed up my tools slower than I needed to, mostly because my arms were tired and partly because I wasn't ready to go home and deal with my phone. When I finally checked it in the truck, there was a text from Marcus waiting. Sign the transfer by Friday, or I do this the hard way. Your choice. I stared at that message for a long time before I started the engine. I didn't know yet what the hard way meant. I will by the end of the week. 2 days passed before I found out. I was in the back office of the venue, going over vendor schedules with a cup of cold coffee at my elbow, when Marcus showed up without calling first. He'd never done that before, not at a job site, and something about the way he stood in the doorway told me this wasn't going to be a conversation. You're not signing, he said. It wasn't a question. I'm not signing something that isn't true, Marcus. Dad split it evenly. You know that. Dad's dead. He doesn't get a vote anymore. He crossed the room fast, faster than I expected from him, and grabbed my arm hard enough that I felt it in my shoulder. I stayed. I ran the shop while you were off getting your engineering degree. That has to count for something. Let go of me. He did, eventually, but not before his fingers left marks I'd feel for a week. He looked almost surprised at himself, the way people do right after they've crossed a line they always told themselves they wouldn't. He backed toward the door, muttered something about how he hadn't meant to grab me that hard, and left before security even knew he'd been there, because I didn't call them. I told myself it was a one-time thing. I told myself a lot of things that week that weren't true. I sat down at the desk after he left and just breathed for a minute, the way you do when your body hasn't caught up with the fact that the danger has passed. My hand was shaking a little when I picked up my pen, and I remember being angrier at that than at Marcus himself. I didn't want to be someone whose hands shook. I'd built a career on staying steady when everyone around me expected me to fall apart. And here I was, alone in a borrowed office, trying to talk myself back into calm before anyone walked in and saw me like this. I covered the bruise with concealer and a long sleeve and went back to work like nothing happened, because that's what I'd always done. Meanwhile, in another part of the estate I wouldn't learn about until later, Dante was going over renovation invoices with his accountant and found a vendor payment that didn't belong, routed through an account tied to Camilla's family, nothing to do with the wedding budget at all. He didn't say anything about it yet. He just remembered it, the way careful men remember things, filed away for a moment when it might matter. That evening he came to check on the ballroom progress, and I wasn't expecting him, so when I reached up to move a drop cloth, my sleeve rode up before I could stop it. He saw the bruise before I could pull the fabric back down. He didn't ask who did it. His face went very still, stiller than I'd seen it, and something about that stillness told me more than any question could have. He said goodnight, like nothing had happened, and left. But the staff who'd worked for him for years later told me they recognized that kind of quiet. It meant he was already deciding what to do about it, working through options the way other men worked through a crossword. I didn't know that yet. All I knew was that a man I'd spoken to twice had looked at my arm like it belonged to someone he intended to protect, and I didn't know what to do with that because nobody had looked at me that way in a long time. If you love watching a quiet, controlled man start unraveling one detail at a time, follow along now, because Dante Marchetti was about to become a lot less controlled. For the next few days, I tried to act normal. I changed my route to the venue so Marcus couldn't predict when I'd be alone. I kept my sleeves down, even the heat, even when the ballroom got so warm from the afternoon sun that the other contractors rolled theirs up. Dante didn't bring up the bruise directly, but he started finding reasons to check on the ballroom himself instead of sending someone else, and each time he asked, carefully, whether everything on my end was manageable. It's fine, I told him more than once, because I'd learned a long time ago that saying it's fine was easier than explaining a lifetime of handling things alone. My father died 2 years ago and left a will vague enough that Marcus decided vague meant negotiable. I built half that firm with my own hands. My name is on 3 of our patents. None of that mattered to Marcus once he decided I owed him something for staying while I left for school. Dante didn't push. He just watched, and quietly, without telling me, he had his head of security, Renzo, start pulling 2 threads at once. Who hurt me? And who that strange vendor payment actually belonged to? Renzo came back a few days later with an answer to the second question that neither of us expected. The payment traced to a shell company controlled by Camilla's uncle. Not wedding expenses. Something else entirely. Something Dante hadn't been looking for and now couldn't ignore. He told me later he sat with that piece of paper for almost an hour before he decided what to do with it. turning it over the way you'd turn over a stone, hoping not to find what's underneath. He didn't tell Renzo to slow down or to keep quiet. He told him to keep digging, but carefully, because a man in his position couldn't afford to accuse an allied family of something he couldn't yet prove. That was the version of Dante most people never saw, the one who moved like an engineer instead of a soldier, checking every measurement twice before he trusted it enough to build on. I wouldn't understand how much that mattered until much later, when the whole structure of that wedding turned out to be resting on exactly the kind of foundation he refused to trust blindly. I didn't know any of this yet. All I knew was that my accounts had gone quiet, and then, without warning, they went worse than quiet. Marcus froze a shared business account tied to the firm, the one I used to pay my lawyer, and he timed it perfectly, right in the middle of my busiest week on this contract. I sat in my truck outside the venue and did the math over and over, and every version of it ended the same way. If I didn't find money fast, I might have to sign just to make the pressure stop. I remember calling my lawyer from that parking lot and hearing the hesitation in her voice when I told her I might need more time. I remember thinking that maybe Marcus had finally figured out the one lever that actually worked on me. Not threats, not anger, just the slow suffocation of not being able to pay the people protecting what was mine. I sat there long after the call ended, watching the security lights flicker on across the vineyard as the sun dropped. I thought about calling Dante just to talk it through, and then I thought better of it. I didn't want him to think I was the kind of person who came to a client with personal problems dressed up as small talk. So I drove home instead, made a list of expenses I could cut, and told myself I'd figure out the way I always figured everything out, alone, at a kitchen table with a calculator and too much coffee. I never told Dante about the frozen account. I didn't have to. 2 days later, my bank called to say the freeze had been reversed, a clerical error corrected on their end. I believed it because I wanted to. I thanked the woman on the phone and didn't think twice about who might have made that call happen. That night, Dante and I ended up talking longer than we meant to, not about danger, not about Marcus, just about our fathers. We sat on the back steps of the estate with the vineyard rows stretching out dark in front of us, and he told me his father had built an empire out of loyalty and fear in equal measure, and Dante had spent his whole life trying to keep the loyalty and get rid of the fear. I told him my father had built a company out of nothing, a folding table and a second-hand drafting kit, and then left a will so unclear it turned his 2 children into strangers who used lawyers to talk to each other. We didn't solve anything that night. We just sat there, 2 guarded people who'd both learned young that leaning on someone else was a risk you paid for later. At one point he laughed, actually laughed, at something small I said about my father's terrible handwriting, and I realized it was the first time I'd heard him do that in 3 weeks of knowing him. When you spend your whole life fixing things alone, it's strange when someone fixes something for you and doesn't ask for anything back. Has that ever happened to you? Tell me below, because for one night, I let myself believe it could last. It didn't last long. Marcus found out the account had been restored, and instead of backing off, he escalated. He filed a formal complaint against me, claiming I'd misused firm funds, backed by records I later learned were partly falsified. It was worse than anything physical he'd done, because this threatened my license, my reputation, the entire foundation of the career I'd spent a decade building. Marchetti's own lawyers flagged me as a liability to the wedding contract within a day, and I watched 2 people who'd been friendly with me for weeks suddenly start avoiding eye contact in the hallway. Camilla approached Dante about it herself, gently, reasonably, suggesting I be quietly dismissed from the project to avoid scandal before the wedding. It sounded like concern. At the time, even I might have believed it was concern if I'd been in the room to hear the careful, sympathetic way she framed it, like she was protecting Dante from a mistake rather than protecting herself from a discovery. I heard about that conversation secondhand from one of the assistants who liked me enough to warn me. She told me Camilla had used the word liability 3 times in 5 minutes, and that Dante had gone quiet in a way that made everyone in the room uncomfortable, the same stillness I'd already learned to recognize. I spent that whole afternoon convinced I was about to lose the contract, packing my tools a little early just in case someone came to tell me not to bother coming back the next day. Nobody did. Dante refused. He told his own advisors no, in a tone that apparently surprised people who'd worked for him for years. Then he came to find me in the back office and told me the truth, all of it, that he'd seen the bruise, that he knew about the frozen account, that he'd had it fixed without telling me. I was furious, not at the help itself, but the fact that he'd done it without asking, managed my life quietly the same way Marcus had tried to control it loudly. Different method, same result, someone else deciding what I could handle. I don't need a protector, I told him, my voice louder than I meant it to be in that small office. I know, he said. Then why did you do it? Because I needed you to ask, and I was afraid you wouldn't, he said. I was wrong. I should have asked you first. That answer didn't fix everything, but it was honest in a way I hadn't expected, and it made me want to hear the rest of it, even angry as I was. He told me why, not what I expected. No dead sibling, no tragic origin story built for sympathy. Years earlier, his cousin Elena had been pressured into an arranged business marriage by her own father, and Dante, younger then, unwilling to challenge the family hierarchy that raised him, said nothing while it happened. He described watching her sit through her own engagement dinner, smiling for photographs, while everyone at the table already knew the arrangement had nothing to do with love. She spent 6 miserable years in that marriage before it finally collapsed. He told me this wasn't about rescuing me. It was about refusing to be the man who stayed silent a second time. He told me Elena still didn't fully trust him, even now, years after the marriage ended, and that he'd never asked her to. He said some silences don't get forgiven just because you finally decide to speak up later. I watched his jaw tighten when he said it, and I understood, in a way I hadn't before, that his protectiveness wasn't about me being fragile. It was about him refusing to become, a second time, the version of himself he was still ashamed of. That reframed everything I thought I understood about him. This wasn't a man who wanted to save a woman to feel powerful. This was a man haunted by the one time he didn't act, trying not to repeat it. I agreed, carefully, to let him help with the fraud claim specifically on the condition that it be framed as a business dispute he was vetting, not a personal favor to me. He agreed, and that same week, Renzo brought him something that changed the shape of everything. The falsified records in Marcus's fraud claim used formatting identical to documents tied to a Ferraro family shell company. Someone had helped my brother build his case, someone with resources and connections my brother had never had on his own. Marcus didn't get smart, Renzo told him, standing in the study with a folder in his hand. Somebody smart got involved. The moment this story stopped being about a wedding and became a setup, everything I thought I understood got turned upside down, so stick around because it only gets more tangled from here. I didn't know about the shell company connection yet. What I knew was that rumors had started circulating among Camilla's circle, and they weren't kind. Some people said I was unstable. Some said the fraud claim was true. Some said I was sleeping with Dante to save my career, which would have been almost funny if it hadn't cost me 2 other contracts within a single week. Clients I'd worked with for years suddenly stopped returning calls, and one sent a curt email saying they decided to go in a different direction, which was the kind of phrase people used when they didn't want to say the real reason out loud. I later learned all 3 rumors had come from the same wedding planning group chat, the one Camilla was part of. I didn't know that yet either. All I knew was that my professional reputation, the one thing I protected through every fight with Marcus, was collapsing in real time over gossip I couldn't trace back to a single source. I spent one entire evening scrolling through old emails, trying to figure out who might have started it, making a list of names I trusted and names I didn't, crossing off client after client until the page was mostly empty. It was a strange kind of grief, watching a reputation I'd built for 10 years lose its footing over a rumor that had nothing to do with reality. I didn't cry over it, but I came close, sitting alone at my kitchen table with my laptop glowing and my coffee gone cold, wondering if this was how it ended, not with a courtroom or a bruise, but with a group chat I'd never even seen. Dante's response wasn't private. He showed up to a gala that week specifically to be seen defending me, publicly, deliberately, a calculated move rather than a quiet rescue. He stood beside me in front of the exact people who'd been whispering in a room full of chandeliers and careful smiles, and made it clear without raising his voice, that anyone who had a problem with me had a problem with him. It wasn't romantic in the way movies make it look. It was strategic, and it was also the first time in over a year that someone had chosen my side in front of people who mattered. I stopped shrinking that night. I don't know how else to describe it. I stood a little straighter, answered a little louder when someone asked what I did for a living, and for once didn't brace myself for the follow-up question that usually came dressed as an insult. At one point, an older woman I recognized from the gossip chain approached us with a compliment about the ballroom's new lighting, clearly fishing for information about the rumors she'd helped spread. Dante answered before I could, mentioning offhand that the woman standing beside him had designed half the estate's recent renovations herself, engineering degree and all, and that he trusted her judgment more than most of the contractors his own family had used for 20 years. It wasn't a dramatic speech. It didn't need to be. The woman's smile went thin. She excused herself quickly, and I had to bite back a grin until she was out of earshot. What I didn't see, because I wasn't in the room, was Camilla watching all of it happen and quietly escalating her own position with her family. She was the one behind the rumors. Not a guess anymore. Not speculation. Confirmed, whispered between her and an uncle in a hallway neither of us knew about at the time. She just hadn't been caught yet. If you already stopped trusting Camilla 2 chapters ago, comment your theory below, because you were right, and it was about to matter a lot more than any of us expected. By the end of that gala, Dante announced, in front of the same guests who'd been gossiping about me, that I would personally oversee the ballroom's final reveal before the wedding. It was a vote of confidence dressed up as a scheduling decision, and everyone in that room understood exactly what it meant. I heard the murmur ripple through the crowd and felt, for the first time in weeks, like the ground under me had stopped shifting. The following week, Renzo confirmed what the shell company had really been for. Camilla's family had been quietly buying up Marchetti supply contracts through the same channel that funded my brother's fraud claim. The wedding was never just a peace treaty between 2 families. It was cover for a slow financial takeover, and I had been collateral damage the whole time, because my father's engineering firm held patents relevant to a shipping contract both families wanted control of. My father's work, the thing Marcus and I had been fighting over for a year, turned out to be worth far more to the people around this wedding than either of us had realized. Dante didn't come to me first with what he'd learned. He went to Camilla, privately, calmly, without accusing her outright, testing to see what she'd give away. He told her he'd found some irregularities in the supply contracts and wanted her family's help understanding them, phrased carefully enough that a guilty person would either relax, thinking they'd gotten away with it, or panic and overcorrect. Camilla did the second. She miscalculated. Standing in his study with a glass of wine she never drank from, she said just enough to confirm everything Renzo suspected, mentioning a detail about the shipping contract that no one outside her family should have known. Then, realizing her mistake, she didn't back down. She threatened him instead, quietly, the way people threaten when they still think they hold the leverage. Calling off the engagement now, she told him, would restart a territory war neither family could afford. Dante had spent his whole life being careful. That threat was the moment he stopped. He finally has the proof he needs, and if you think he's about to burn the whole arrangement down anyway, hit like right now, because you already know this man better than his own family does. The final confrontation didn't happen quietly, and it didn't happen the way I expected. Marcus, informed by someone in Camilla's family that his usefulness was ending, panicked. He came to the venue one last time, angrier and more reckless than before, timed deliberately to make it look like the confrontation happened on Marchetti property, an attempt to embarrass Dante in front of his own family during the final wedding walkthrough. Renzo had already flagged Marcus's movements that morning, so when my brother grabbed my arm in the back hallway of the ballroom, shouting that I'd ruined everything, that I'd turned some Mafia boss against his own family, Dante was already walking toward us before I even called out. He didn't touch Marcus. He didn't have to. His presence, and the 2 men behind him, were enough to end it in seconds. Marcus's shoulders dropped the moment he saw them, all the anger draining out of him at once, replaced by something closer to fear. For one strange second, I almost felt sorry for him, my brother, standing there realizing how far outside his depth he'd swum. Then I remembered the bruise on my arm and the frozen account and the fraud claim, and the feeling passed. He was handed over to actual authorities, along with the falsified documents Renzo had traced back to their source, a legal resolution to a threat that had started as something legal in the first place. No vigilante justice. No blood on anyone's hands. Just consequences finally arriving the way they should have arrived months earlier. I stood in that hallway afterward, arms wrapped around myself, and Dante didn't try to hold me or tell me it was over. He just stayed close, quiet, giving me room to feel whatever I needed to feel before we walked back in the ballroom together. Then, in front of every family member who had gathered for that final walkthrough, Dante stood in the middle of his own ballroom and called off the wedding. He laid out the shell company evidence plainly, without theatrics, holding up documents instead of raising his voice, and ended an alliance that had never been anything but a slow theft wearing a white dress. Camilla's face went pale, then furious, then blank, in that order, as her own relatives realized what she'd been part of. He didn't do it to save me. He told me that himself, later, when the room had emptied and it was just the two of us standing among half-finished floral arrangements no one would use. He did it because staying silent had already cost him one person he loved. He wasn't going to let it cost him a second. The wedding just ended in front of every person who mattered to that family. And if you want to see how Vivian and Dante handle the fallout, stay with me for the final part, because it's not the ending you're expecting. In the weeks that followed, Marcus faced real prosecution, built almost entirely on my own testimony and the records Renzo had recovered. I didn't need Dante's money or his influence to win back what was mine. I gave my own statement, sat through my own depositions, presented my own evidence, and the inheritance dispute resolved itself on legal terms I had earned, not terms someone had handed me. My professional reputation, the thing I'd fought hardest to protect, came out of it intact, and two of the clients who'd walked away actually called to apologize once the truth came out. I saw Marcus once more, in a courthouse hallway, waiting for a hearing neither of us wanted to be at. He looked smaller than I remembered, like the anger that used to fill up every room he walked into had finally run out of fuel. He didn't apologize, not really, just said he hoped I was doing okay, in a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone else. I told him I was, and I meant it, and then I walked past him to sit with my lawyer instead of him, which felt like its own kind of ending. The firm my father built stayed mine, whole, with my name on the door the way it should have been from the beginning. I hired a new office manager, someone who had nothing to do with my family, and for the first time in over a year, I stopped flinching every time my phone rang. The Ferraro alliance collapsed within the month. Dante lost territory in the short term, more than his advisors were comfortable with, and I watched him sit through long, tense meetings trying to renegotiate terms with families who smelled weakness the moment a wedding fell apart. But he gained something else instead. Word spread fast among the other families that he couldn't be pressured, couldn't be leveraged, couldn't be coerced in his silence the way his younger self once had been. Several families that had never respected him before started to, and I noticed the way people spoke to him differently after that, with less flattery and more caution, which he seemed to prefer. The last time we spoke about all of it, we were standing in the finished ballroom, the same one I'd spent weeks scaffolding and measuring and defending with my own hands. Late afternoon light came through the tall windows, catching the dust still settling from the last of the cleanup crews, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all. He told me he'd almost made the same mistake twice, solving my problems instead of standing beside me while I solved them myself. He said it plainly, no excuses built into it, the same way he'd told me about Elena weeks earlier. He didn't propose. I want to be clear about that, because I know what this genre usually promises at the end. He offered me a future instead, open-ended, undecided, mine to shape on my own timeline. After a year of being told what I owed other people, after watching two families try to sign away pieces of my life without asking me first, that mattered more to me than any ring could have. No deadlines, he said. No paperwork. Just you deciding whenever you decide if you want any of this at all. I laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprised even me. That's a strange thing for a man who runs half this territory to promise. I'm better at keeping promises than making them look easy, he said. You'll have a trust to follow through instead of the speech. I said yes to the future, not the wedding. Not yet. I walked into that ballroom one last time before I left for the night, the space I had built with my own hands, standing on a reputation nobody could take from me anymore. The chandeliers I'd rehung myself caught the last of the evening light, and the floor I'd argued over for weeks finally looked the way I'd always pictured it. Dante walked one step behind me, not in front, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, that felt like exactly where things were supposed to be. If this story gave you the ending you didn't know you wanted, subscribe right now, because the next story is already waiting, and trust me, you don't want to miss how it starts.